All right, welcome to the webinar on the Brain Initiative Fellows RFA, which is RFA MH18510. I'm Ashley Vampier, and I'm going to be discussing this Brain Initiative Fellows RFA today in the webinar. So first, I'm going to provide some background on the Brain Initiative and then go over information that's pertinent to the request for application, or RFA. And then at the end, there's going to be an opportunity for some general questions. So during the webinar, you will be muted. And if you have any questions, you can submit them through the chat box. There's a Q&A box on the side of the screen, and we'll answer these at the end. But if your question isn't answered at the end, please email us after the webinar so we can help you. And the email for this opportunity is below my name here. It's brain.initiative.training@nih.gov. So as you're all aware, brain disorders affect all of us. So on this slide, I've just listed some examples for several brain disorders, including neurodegenerative, cognitive and affective, neurodevelopmental, and injury-induced disorders. So there's a list of some examples of each of these, and what's common to all of them is that there are limited treatments. So there's a clear need to advance our understanding of the brain, and through this understanding, improve the treatment and outcomes for those affected by these disorders. And really, the ultimate goal is that further research can bring about cures to these types of disorders. So, our ultimate goal is that further research on the brain is going to be able to bring about some cures to these disorders. So this chart we have here is I think, it really emphasizes the impact that neurological disorders have in the United States. So listed here are the top 7 leading categories of DALYS for the year 2010, and DALY is an acronym for Disability Adjusted Life Years. And it's a measure of overall disease burden, and it's expressed as the number of years lost due to ill health, disability, or early death. And so what you can see here is that neuropsychiatric disorders, including mental and behavioral disorders and neurological disorders, account for about 19% of the total U.S. DALYs in 2010. And that really is above or surpassing what many people think of as the big problems in the U.S., such as number 2 below it, cardiovascular disease. And neuropsychiatric diseases are particularly high contributors for DALYs because many occur early in life. So here you can see that the trajectory of cumulative DALYs by age in this graph, and how mental and behavioral disorders has the highest curve for most of the charts, showing how they persist for a long period of time compared to the other disorders that are shown on the chart. So hopefully, I think everyone knows the need is great. Brain disorders are the #1 cause of disabilities in the United States. It's over 100 million people affected now, and the rates are increasing, as you, I'm sure, are aware, with people living longer and Alzheimer's disease rates increasing. There's increased PTSD and TBI with those in the military, and costs are also increasing. So here, as an estimate, the cost of dementia annually is $200 billion, and that equals the cost of cancer and heart disease. And obviously, these costs are going to continue to rise. So the challenge for the current century is really to deal with such chronic non-communicable diseases like brain diseases, and they'll be what infectious diseases were in the last century. So brain disorders, both neurodevelopmental and neurodegenerative, are the most disabling and most costly of these kinds of chronic diseases. And we don't know enough about the brain to meet this challenge now. So that's where the Brain Initiative comes in, and the NIH. So many of you have probably heard about the BRAIN initiative. It's this BRAIN scientific plan is described in BRAIN 2025, a scientific vision. This is a document that was published in 2014 with the idea that over a 10-year period there would be major advances made in our understanding of the brain. And the first 5 years are to emphasize the development of technologies that are needed to rapidly advance our understanding of the brain. And the second 5 years is intended to emphasize discovery-driven science. The awards under the BRAIN initiative were made in the calendar year 2015, so we're now in the years of emphasizing technology development, and we're starting to think about the transition to an emphasis on discovery-driven science. So this report, the BRAIN 2025 report, which is available online at the link that I show at the top, which is braininitiative.nih.gov. It provides a lot more detail than I'm going to be able to present to you in the next few slides. So I think it's really important. I encourage you to review the report online so you can get some more background information that will likely be relevant as you're preparing an application to the BRAIN F32. So a brief summary of the report, though, its focus is on brain circuits and networks. And as I said, the first few years are emphasizing the development and validation of technology, and then with a gradual increase in the emphasis on problem-driven neuroscience. And the goals of the BRAIN initiative are to map the cells and circuits of the brain, measure the electrical and chemical patterns within these circuits, and then to put this all together to understand how all cells and circuits and their fluctuating patterns generate thought and action. There are 7 high-priority research areas, which I'm going to briefly describe, and it's really important for you when thinking about your research project is to think of how it aligns with the goals of the BRAIN initiative. So the first priority area is discovering diversity, to identify and provide experimental access to the different brain cell types so that we can understand their roles in health and disease. So examples are, say, labs doing self-census work in various species and trying to categorize the many neurons and glial cell types that are in the brain and their transcriptional components. The second goal is to map at multiple scales to generate circuit diagrams that differ in the level of resolution, from resolution of the level of the synapse to the whole brain. The third is the brain in action, by developing a dynamic picture of the functioning brain through development of improved methods for large-scale monitoring of neural activity. Fourth is demonstrating causality, that is to link brain activity to behavior using a very precise tool that will alter neural circuit dynamics. The fifth priority area is to identify fundamental principles, so that's to produce the conceptual foundation so that we can understand the biological basis of mental processes by developing new theoretical and data analytical tools. The sixth is advancing human neuroscience so we can begin to understand the human brain using new and innovative technologies and to treat its disorders and develop integrated human brain research networks. And the seventh priority area is to go from the BRAIN initiative and its focus on technological and conceptual approaches to brain, and to integrate these to inform how dynamic patterns of neural activity are transformed into cognitive, emotion, perception, and action in both health and disease. So the description and background information related to these goals is in the BRAIN 2025 report on the BRAIN Initiative website, which again I list here at the bottom of the screen. So again, I think it's really important for you to visit that site and check out the whole report if you're interested in this opportunity. There's also information on the website about all of the funded awards through the BRAIN initiative, including links to the abstracts of these awards, and they're actually organized by the different goals of the BRAIN initiative, so that should help you to understand how the NIH is thinking about accomplishing the objectives that I just went through. So additionally, besides the scientific goals, the BRAIN 2025 report also has some educational goals, and these are less specific than the scientific and technical goals, but they are relevant when considering the expectations of the BRAIN F32 RFA. So the first is the strong emphasis on the importance of acquiring quantitative skills. The report writers for the BRAIN 2025 report felt that this really was an area where many people being trained in brain research currently aren't adequately prepared for the future. So it is really a goal here of the BRAIN initiative. The second is to ensure that the tools and technologies and methods that are developed under the BRAIN initiative are integrated into the training of individuals who are currently in graduate school and postdoctoral positions. And the last one is the importance of considering the ethical implications of neuroscience research. So as we begin to think about the use of interventional tools in human neuroscience, the ethical implications become more obvious, and it's an area where there is a gap in both our training individuals and having an adequate pool of well-trained individuals. So now I'm going to go into some details specifically on the RFA and some important components. So the purpose of this RFA generally is to enhance the training of promising postdocs early in their postdoctoral training period. The research must be in an area that's aligned with the BRAIN initiative, including neuroethics. So again, this is an important point. Alignment means that it needs to fit with one of the high priority goals that I just reviewed. So also we're encouraging individuals to cross traditional areas of expertise. So we're encouraging those, say, that have received training in quantitative disciplines like physics and math to do research on the brain. So because to accomplish the goals of the BRAIN initiative, we really need well-trained individuals who can easily cross traditional boundaries and employ quantitative and computational approaches to questions about the brain. So we're interested in receiving applications from those who have received graduate training in a variety of disciplines. So for example, physics, chemistry, computer science, engineering, math, ethics, in addition to neuroscience. So this RFA is really not intended only for those with advanced degrees in neuroscience. So this is an important slide that lists some important details regarding the RFA, which are also all contained in the announcement. So first, we request a letter of intent by email 30 days prior to the application due date. So that would be February 15th for the first due date. This isn't required, though, but the reason we request a letter of intent is that it helps us get an idea of the number of applications we're likely to receive, and then this helps us in organizing and preparing for the review of the applications. So the first due date is March 15th, and we anticipate that the earliest start date for awards that are made from that first round would be in September of 2018. There are also due dates on December 7th and August 7th, 2019, and April 7th, 2020. For project duration, NIH policy is that postdocs may receive up to 3 years of NRSA support in aggregate, which includes the F32 as well as support from institutional training grants, or T32s. So if you're currently or will be supported on institutional training grant or T32 before this F32 award would begin, you would have to subtract the number of months that you've been or will be supported on that T32 from the duration of individual fellowship support from this F32 when you request the number of months of support in the application. It's also really important to determine if you're eligible to apply for this funding opportunity. So for this F32, you must be a citizen of the United States, a non-citizen national, or a permanent resident of the U.S. by the time of award. And that's by the time of award. So if you're currently applying for permanent resident status and you anticipate that you will receive it by the time of award, then you can apply if you meet the other eligibility requirements. Another component is about prior postdoc experience. So in the RFA, it states that on the due date, individuals may not have completed more than 12 months postdoctoral training as measured from the date when you completed all of your doctoral degree requirements. If you're right at around the cutoff, then I suggest you contact me and we can discuss this further. But in the application, you're instructed in your biosketch to indicate the date either that you completed all of your doctoral degree requirements or that when you anticipate they will be completed. I also want to note that time spent on parental, medical, or other well-justified leave will not count in this. It has to be actually months spent doing postdoctoral research. So the eligibility criteria on time as a postdoc is important, as I was describing, because this RFA is really for early postdoctoral training. And this is different from some other NIH postdoctoral research opportunities which don't have such eligibility windows associated with the application. But for the BRAIN F32, the thinking is that we are interested in maximizing the training potential of this funding opportunity and the award for you. So the longer that someone remains in the same laboratory, the less training potential there is. So eligibility is limited to no more than 12 months of postdoctoral experience. But it's important to note that you can also apply as a graduate student before you complete all of your terminal doctoral degree requirements. But you should expect to complete all of these within 1 year of the application due date. And given that we're expecting applications from people who are quite early in their postdoctoral training, or maybe haven't even joined their postdoc lab yet because they're still graduate students, we're not expecting there to be preliminary data in the application. So it's okay for you to include preliminary data, but we're not expecting it. What we do expect, though, is that you demonstrate the project is feasible and that you include the expected outcomes and alternative outcomes and have a plan for what you would do if the project doesn't go in the direction that you expect. So, for example, on the review criteria, which are listed in the announcement under the training plan, it says, and this is a quote for what the reviewers are going to be assessing, does the discussion of expected results and potential pitfalls and alternative outcomes provide confidence that if an important component of the research is unsuccessful, the applicant is likely to have a viable direction for continuing the project? So that's important for you to think about when you're putting your application together, because that's how the reviewers are going to be assessing the application, and they'll expect to see how you're thinking about what you would do if things don't turn out as you were anticipating. Now I'm going to discuss some expectations of the RFA, and you can also find all this information in the announcement under the funding opportunity description. And I'm not going to go over all parts of the application, but here really highlight what may be different from the BRAIN F32 compared to other F32 funding opportunities. So first, as I discussed before, the research and training proposed must be relevant to one or more of the goals of the BRAIN initiative. It should focus on a research area and or skill set that complements your existing expertise and skills and broadens your knowledge and skills. So it's expected that the training will be using cutting-edge tools, theories, and or approaches that are aligned with the BRAIN initiative. The proposal should expand the expertise that you acquired in graduate training. So, for example, an applicant who already has a lot of training and expertise in molecular neuroscience might propose a research plan that emphasizes systems-level training, or someone could have been working on protein structure and is now going to propose to do some genetic analyses in zebrafish, or someone in physics or statistics might propose a research training plan emphasizing computational approaches to neuroscience. And we're expecting to see formal training that will enhance the rigor of the proposed research. And what that means really is formal training in experimental design, quantitative perspectives, and analytical tools, and this should be integrated within your research plan. We also expect strong mentorship, whether you propose one or more mentors. So you have to have at least one mentor. You can have more than one mentor if appropriate for the goals of your training. If you have a team of mentors, then the role of each mentor should be clearly defined and appropriate given their expertise. If your mentor, say, hasn't transitioned a postdoc to a faculty position, and generally that's if they're relatively junior, then we suggest you add a more experienced individual as a co-mentor, because this is a frequent issue that's raised at review of fellowship applications and can be easily avoided by having a co-mentor. You also should not have a history of collaborating with your primary mentor based on the goals of this RFA. We expect that there will be appropriate training and career development opportunities proposed in the application. An opportunity here means something that would fulfill your training needs and help you achieve your goals, including your professional goals and goals related to acquiring the so-called soft skills that are needed to be an effective scientist. There should be a strong institutional support and commitment, which is in part reflected in the adequacy and appropriateness of the resources and facilities for the proposed project. Your mentor training plan should facilitate your transition to the next career stage, and we're looking for a plan to enhance your professional skills and ensure that you have what you need to be able to transition to the next career stage at the end of the F32 award. And the training plan should document the need for and the value of the proposed training in relation to your career goals and your prior research training. The goal is for you to become a subject matter expert in your proposed research area, to learn new technical skills, learn to incorporate quantitative approaches to answering research questions, and have the professional skills necessary to reach your next career stage. All of these expectations I'm going to list here too are found in Section 1 of the funding opportunity description under the heading Specific Objectives of this FOA. So we expect that the training experience will provide a strong foundation in quantitative reasoning and methods, statistics and analytical techniques that are appropriate for your research. We expect it's sufficient for you to be able to generate robust and reproducible data. You should have experience conducting research using state-of-the-art tools and methods, and really strong understanding of those tools and methods. There should be opportunities to present research findings at national meetings as the work progresses. There should be opportunities to publish the research findings as first author, opportunities to interact with members of the scientific community, and professional skills needed to transition to the next stage of the applicant's research career. So really you want to make sure that all of these points are considered and included in your application. I wanted to mention now a couple points about the mentor and the mentor's role, because for this funding opportunity there are some specific expectations that are outlined in the RFA that are not part of the usual F32 announcement. So first, we're encouraging you to select a primary mentor with whom you haven't collaborated already during pre-doctoral training. So that's not that if you just joined a postdoc lab that you can't have that lab head as your primary mentor, but it's really to maximize training potential. So training potential in general is enhanced when you're not working with the same person you've already worked with for a number of years. So anyone from your graduate training would not be appropriate. Second, we expect that the primary mentor will have research expertise that's relevant to the goals of the BRAIN initiative, and then can provide an appropriate environment for your research training in this area. And the reviewers are going to evaluate the appropriateness of the mentor as part of their assessment of the scientific and technical merit of your application. So it is worth spending time thinking about this. And again, having more than one mentor is fine if that's appropriate for what you're trying to do, or, you know, a small committee, although be careful when putting a committee together that you don't have too many people, because there needs to be some way for them to work effectively and to coordinate your mentoring. The sponsor or mentor also needs to write a section of the application as required. And so here I'm just highlighting some points that are specific to this BRAIN F32 for that section. So they need to describe their qualifications to train a postdoctorate who seeks mentor training in an area relevant to the goals of the BRAIN initiative, like I described before. And they also must describe how the proposed training provides a new research direction for you and how it provides a foundation for a research career that's relevant to the goals of the BRAIN initiative. And also think about documenting plans for didactics to ensure a robust grounding in quantitative knowledge. So the training plan that your sponsor is writing really should match what you're putting in your section for your training goals. And this is in addition to all of the other parts that the sponsor needs to put about their current support and others that they're supporting in the lab and the standard information in an F32 application. Your sponsor also must include a plan for clear separation of your research and research career from their career, including identifying the components of the research plan that you may take with you. So this part is about responsiveness to this RFA, and because it's a request for applications, or RFA, from NIH, it means that the NIH has the ability to assess if the application is generally responsive to the goals of the initiative. And for an application to be responsive, the research that's being proposed must be relevant to scientific goals of the BRAIN 2025 report as described, and an attachment that you have to include in the application. Further information on this attachment can be found in the announcements in section 4.2 under other project information, other attachments. So this is really important because you need to have this attachment as part of your application, and if you don't, then it's automatically going to be declared not responsive. NIH staff who are working on the initiative are going to be reviewing this information, the attachment, and determining if the application is relevant to one or more of the goals of the BRAIN initiative. So if staff do not find the application to be responsive, it also won't be reviewed. So So obviously, and it's important to determine that your application is likely responsive. And really, to be sure, you should contact us prior to submitting your application. And prior doesn't mean a day or two or even a week before the application is due, but really, you know, a few weeks before, because then we'll have time to provide some feedback to you, and you will have time to respond to the feedback in your application. So it's most helpful if you would send the information that I've listed here on this slide, and that includes your current NIH biosketch, a draft of your specific aims, the name of your proposed mentor or mentors, if it's more than one, a description of how the proposed research and training will complement your prior training. So that could be just a paragraph, description of the BRAIN initiative level tools and approaches that you plan to use in the project, and then a description of the relationship of the proposed research to one of the 7 goals in the BRAIN 2025 report. And then we'll review them and provide you with some feedback as to our assessment of the responsiveness. And then, as I said, we can provide other technical assistance on the training plan that you're proposing. So really, I'd encourage anyone interested in applying for this to send this info to us, and also, you know, sooner rather than later. So in the last few slides, I highlight some important points in putting together an application for this particular RFA, but really it's critical that you read all of the instructions, because there are many other parts of the application, and I don't have the time here to focus on those parts of the application, but you can find all the information through the instructions and in the funding announcement. So the funding announcement actually doesn't have all the instructions you'll need, so you'll want to look at the general instruction guide for fellowships, and this is linked in the RFA. And also make sure you are using the appropriate forms for the submission date. So right now the NIH will be moving to the what's called Forms E. It's like the latest update. So if that is relevant, then you should check to make sure you're using the most updated forms. There's also RFA-specific information that's being requested for most of the sections that are required components, which is a lot of what I talked about, but all of these extra instructions are found in the RFA, not in the general instructions. So it's important to look at both of them. And I also suggest that you remind your sponsor about these RFA-specific instructions, because there's additional components, as I talked about, for their section that they'll need to include that they may not be used to putting in their parts because it's not part of the general instructions. Also in the RFA, there's questions that are posted under each of the scored review criteria in Section 5, so I think it's really helpful for you to go in there and read those review questions, because they'll really give you an idea of what kind of information you want to provide, because that's how the reviewers will be judging your application. And there's also, some other requirements part of the application that I didn't talk about, but certainly you're going to want to make sure you include those, like your sponsors and your biosketch, the section on responsible conduct of research, any letters of support. So again, make sure you read all of the instructions. And also you have to have at least three letters of reference. And make sure that the referees submit their letters in by the due date for the application, because they're sending their letters in apart from your application, but it's still required to arrive by the due date for the application. And you really need to make sure that all parts are submitted, because unfortunately, if an application is incomplete, it will not be reviewed. And the letter writers that you have for the reference letters should be, can't be anyone that is a sponsor or part of the research proposal that you're putting in. So one other thing I want to mention, and maybe some of you have heard of this, is some changes to the clinical trials policies that the NIH is making. So a couple of years ago, the NIH updated their definition of a clinical trial. So it's a research study in which one or more human subjects are prospectively assigned to one or more interventions, which may include placebo or other control, to evaluate the effects of those interventions on health-related biomedical or behavioral outcomes. And it really encompasses a wide range of studies, from mechanistic to exploratory and development, pilot feasibility, interventional and behavioral studies. And I think there's some, if you're doing work with humans, you should go to the website listed here to determine whether your proposal would be considered a clinical trial. So I'll give you an example of one that maybe doesn't sound like a clinical trial to you, but the NIH would consider it one. So say there's a study that involves the recruitment of healthy volunteers who are randomly assigned, either between subject or within subject in a counterbalance design, to one of two experimental conditions to enhance or interfere with cognitive performance. So the effects of these conditions on cognitive performance, for example, if you're looking at working memory and brain function during the cognitive performance task, be measured with fMRI. So that would be considered a clinical trial. Another one would be if you were looking at healthy volunteers who are randomized to different durations of sleep deprivation and then have their stress hormone levels measured, and the design would be to determine whether the levels of stress hormones in blood rise in response to different durations of sleep duration. So that's also considered a clinical trial. So although for fellowship applications, independent clinical trials are not allowed, so the announcement will say that it can't be a clinical trial. They do encourage fellows to obtain experience in clinical trials. So if you're proposing something that is what would be considered a clinical trial, you can't be the one in charge, or you can't be the responsible party for the clinical trial, and that means that your sponsor is going to have to include some additional information in their component, which is the source of funding, their clinicaltrials.gov identifier for the study, and then a description of how their expertise is appropriate to guide you in any proposed clinical trials research experience. So that's all I really wanted to discuss today, just a highlight of some of the important points of the RFA. So at this time, if you have any questions, you can put them into the Q&A box, or if you think of any following this, then please email me at the email address listed on the slide. And I'd also encourage you to visit the BRAIN Initiative's website listed here for additional information, especially, as I talked about a lot, the BRAIN 2025 report. So we did get a few questions in advance, and I'll start with those, and if anyone has any other questions, they could come in. So one question that came in was, does the sponsor need to have an R1 to sponsor an F32 application? And the answer is no. They don't need to have an R1, although the reviewers are going to be looking at what kind of support the sponsor has, because the fellowship doesn't provide any research funds. So the reviewers are going to want to see evidence that there's going to be research support available for the fellow applicant to conduct the research that is proposed. So ideally, the sponsor will have R01 or other funding, and often if a sponsor doesn't have much active funding, often a co-sponsor is also included in the application that, in addition to providing research expertise, can also provide support if needed for the research project. So another question is it allowable to submit 2 applications for the F32 during the same cycle with non-overlapping aims in each application? So that would be essentially different projects. And the answer to this is that if the individual can't have 2 or more competing Kirstein and RSA individual fellowship applications pending review concurrently. So this means that if you submitted to the March deadline of this BRAIN F32, you cannot also submit an application for the April deadline for the parent F32. In general, after review, you'll receive a summary statement which has the reviewed critiques, and prior to a resubmission, you need to have that summary statement released. So I don't know, is there any other questions? So one question is, can you propose work in a foreign country? And that's possible. Foreign components are allowed. And it's also possible to submit an application from a foreign institution as long as you, the candidate, are meeting the citizenship requirement. So there's another question. Would it be possible to get the slides from this presentation? Yes, we will have the information collected, and then we have all of your emails from registration, so we can send it out to everyone who's on the webinar. So there's another question. Is a non-BRAIN initiative F32 more likely to fund a proposal with mentor that the applicant has collaborated in the past? So I would say for the BRAIN initiative, if it really was someone that you had worked with in the past and is now going to be your sponsor, then that's really not a good fit for the BRAIN initiative. So we wouldn't be very enthusiastic about it because, as I said, it's important for you to increase your training potential by working with individuals who you've not trained with in the past. Depending on the role of that person in the application, I think, we'd have to have some more information about what is exactly proposed and whether that would be appropriate also for the parent F32. But it's not a requirement for the parent, so I guess the answer could be yes, because at least it's not a requirement that you need a mentor that you haven't trained with, so you would be able to submit to the parent F32 in that way. But again, the reviewers may still have a similar concern about you not increasing your training potential if you've already been in the environment and trained with that person previously. Okay, so there's another one about the clinical trials. So observational/imaging studies are acceptable for the postdoc to oversee under the F32. So I think it would be important to send to us the information about what you plan on doing, what kinds of studies, and we can provide more information if we're able to see, the details of what you plan on doing. But in general, yes, you can do those types of studies, but if it's something that the NIH would consider a clinical trial, then you cannot be the responsible party. Your mentor has to be, and that's why they need to provide information about their source of funding and the clinicaltrials.gov number for that trial, since it should be registered in clinicaltrials.gov. So someone wrote they're applying for postdocs, but not sure which PI they'll work with. So would it be appropriate for them to apply if they don't know who they will be working with at that time? So I think this would make putting an application together challenging, since there is a large, you should be coming up with this research project in coordination with a mentor that you're going to be proposing to work with, and there's a whole section of the application that the mentor has to write. So, you know, I think that it's possible you might have a few people that you're planning to work with, and at the same institution, it might make it a little easier in the beginning, maybe to put something together based on the environment and what you expect to do in the resources there. But in the end, you're going to have to name a sponsor, and they're going to have to put in their piece in the application, and the application has to come through the institution where that person is working. So you don't get to submit the application yourself. It goes through the institution, so you'll have to identify that place, or else you won't be able to submit the application at all. So here's the question: what's the difference between sponsor and primary mentor? Basically, the sponsor and mentor are the same thing. In the application, I think it's usually referred to as a sponsor, but you can think of the sponsor as the head of the lab or your mentor, and you have to have at least one person that is going to be mentoring you through the research and training, but you can add additional co-mentors or co-sponsors if their expertise is a critical component of your training, and it's, you know, that you need in addition to what your primary mentor has. And then you can also add other people that might have a lesser role in other positions, like consultants and collaborators. So there's something someone wrote about they're an epidemiologist with a background in neuroscience that wants to do a postdoc in neuroepidemiology. So I think that would be, it would be most helpful if that person would send their specific aims to us, because it's kind of hard to determine just when people writing general statements of what you want to do, whether it really is something that fits within the goals of the BRAIN initiative or not. So I would encourage that person to email us with a draft of their specific aims. So at this point, I don't see any more questions. I'll give a few seconds longer, or else, if anyone has questions that come up as they think about this further, or they need more space than the Q&A box allows, then feel free to email me at the brain.initiative.training@nih.gov, and we'll follow up then. All right, thanks everyone for listening, and we hope to get some draft aims coming into us so we can help you out in preparing your application for the BRAIN F32.